Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today, inshallah, we'll talk about a very important topic, the alternation of generation or generations that occurs in plants. And it helps us understand the life cycle and the different stages that they go through. And this will complete our overview which we had started previously. Stated simply, the alternation of generation means that the plants spend their life in two different stages. Just like the tadpole does not resemble the adult frog, or the toddler does not resemble the adult human, the plants go to different stages. The two main stages are called the gametophyte stage and the sporophyte stage. They're easy to remember because the gametophyte stage produces gametes and the sporophyte stage produces spores. Now this is a simplistic picture to which we're going to add some details. The gametophyte stage is a haploid stage, which means that it has half the number of chromosomes. And the gametes it produces, of course, are also haploid. And the gametes fuse to form a diploid zygote, and it is this diploid zygote that grows to become the sporophyte, which is diploid. So this is probably a more accurate representation of this cycle. The gametophyte stage is a haploid stage, which produces haploid gametes. The gametes, such as sperm and egg, they fuse to form a zygote, which is a diploid zygote. And the diploid grows into the sporophyte, which is diploid. Now, the sporophyte organism develops into, for example, a big tree. Some part of that tree, such as the flower, specializes, and it is this specialized structures that give rise to spores, which are also haploid. So even though the sporophyte generation is diploid, it is able to produce specialized structures where haploid spores can be produced. And it is these haploid spores that give rise to the gametophyte generation, which then produces the gametes. Now you might be saying, well, why is it so complicated? Why couldn't it be simple? All these fancy names to remember, etc. Now imagine if the gametophyte generation did not go through this process and it generated itself like this in a cyclical form, there would be no genetic variation. It is for genetic variation that this process seems to have evolved. Indeed, formation of gametes and then the zygote and the new sporophyte generation generates tremendous amount of genetic variability, which is healthy and important for the survival of the species. Now we can understand this process as an evolutionary benefit to the plants, in that the gametophyte generation produces gametes, and gametes fuse to form the zygote, resulting in genetic variability, giving a new organism, and this new organism produces haploid spores, which produces the gamete generation again. Now we shall talk about the life cycle of plant then in a little bit more detail, but if you keep in mind that there is a sporophyte generation that gives rise to spores, and then to the gametophyte generation, it would be helpful. So imagine this, that there's a sporophyte tree. So imagine a tree like this, a conifer. This is a mature conifer. Now, some part of the conifers will specialize, just like the cones over there specialize, and they in fact produce the spores. And the spores that are produced are haploid spores. In fact, there are two types of cones. There's a male cone and a female cone. Now the spores themselves can give rise to a new generation, and that is the gametophyte generation. So there is a female gametophyte and then there is a male gametophyte. And it is these gametophyte that give rise to the gametes, and then the gametes fuse. When the gametes fuse, they produce a fertilized egg, which is diploid. And it is this fertilized egg, the diploid, the zygote, that gives rise to a new saprophyte generation. And this little tree will grow to become again a mature diploid tree, which then will develop special organs to produce spores again. Now this is a cycle of alternation of generation. The highlighted area here is the gametophyte generation, which is haploid, starting with the spores, which give rise to the male and female gametophytes, which then eventually give rise to gametes, which fuse to give the zygote. And it is a zygote that develops into a new diploid generation of sporophyte. Now we have suggested previously that plants can be divided into seedless plants and those that produce seed. The seedless plants can be divided further into those that are non-vascular and those that are vascular. The most simplest of plants, like mosses, etc., they don't produce seeds and they don't have any vasculature. And then there are slightly more advanced plants that do have some vascular system, but they're still seedless. Most evolutionary advanced plants produce seeds and are vascular. Now, going back to the alternation of generation, there's another way we can subclassify plants. Evolutionary speaking, at least, the gametophyte generation is evolutionarily older, so to speak. It's more ancient evolutionarily. And then it figured out that you can generate genetic variability by going through this process. So this process of alternation of generation is an evolutionary advance that started with the gametophyte generation. So if you were to go into the ancient history of plants, so to speak, there will be only gametophytes, and then they evolved to produce this particular system of alternation of generation, which gives rise to more genetic variability. Now, the gametophyte generation, therefore, is historically more ancient than the sporophyte generation. And indeed, you would say that the more primitive forms of plants will have a dominant gametophyte generation, whereas the more advanced plants will have a more dominant sporophyte generation. So the more primitive forms of plants will have a dominant gametophyte generation, and the more advanced type of plants will have a more dominant sporophyte generation. Now, what does that mean? Now, watch this. The kingdom of plants, if you were to examine this, the more primitive of plants, for example, the seedless non-vascular plants, as we had described, the seedless non-vascular plants, which are over here, their dominant form is the gametophyte generation. See right here. The majority of the plant is in the haploid state, whereas the more advanced plants, they have the sporophyte generation that dominates. The majority of the plant is more sporophyte, and the gametophyte generation is a very small part of its life cycle like that. The moss, for example, is a very primitive plant, and majority of the plant, if you would put a hand on the moss, it would be the gametophyte generation, and the sporophyte generation is a very small part of the plant and plant life cycle. Whereas the more advanced plants, it will be the sporophyte generation that dominates. Thus, the plant kingdom, as you recall, was divided into the seedless non-vascular plants, the most primitive form of plants, and then there is the seedless vascular plants and the seed plants, which are always vascular. And you will observe that in the most primitive form, the seedless non-vascular plants, it is the gametophyte generation that dominates. Beyond these, even the seedless vascular plants will have a sporophyte generation that is dominant, and the seed plants, you'll see, it is the sporophyte generation that dominates. And that is intuitive, because you would rather have 2 copies of DNA, just there are more genes to work with than a single copy of chromosome. In summary then, the kingdom of plants can be divided into 3 broad categories: seedless non-vascular plants, which are the most basic of plants, and in these plants is the gametophyte generation that dominates, and the seedless vascular plants, and in these plants the sporophyte generation dominates, and the seed plants where the sporophyte generation dominates. Our study of plants, therefore, will be divided into these 3 parts. First, we shall study the seedless non-vascular plants, and in part 2, we shall study the seedless vascular plants, and in part 3, we shall study the seed plant. Until next time, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.